Hello, David. How are you?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm very, very well.
Good. So we originally had planned to do this interview at Mount Vernon, but for logistical reasons, it's easier to do it this way. So you're in Florida, and I am in my home in Bethesda, Maryland. So I just want to let everybody know that you are somebody that has been to Mount Vernon. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And I so enjoyed it. It is a trip that I hope every American would try to take. And I know some people could never afford it, but it is a wonderful, wonderful historical site. Seeing the home of George Washington, the working farm that he ran. We think of him as a military leader and as the first president of the United States, but he was also a working farmer. Um, uh, Bigger farms than we're generally accustomed to even back then, but he was a working man. And it was a wonderful experience for me to see the beauty of that spot and to learn so much more about him.
Now, Justice Sotomayor, for everybody who is watching, became a justice, an associate justice of the Supreme Court in August of 2009. And she had previously been a circuit court judge, Second Circuit in New York, and in the Second District, and also a district court judge before that. And she's a native of Bronx. She is a summa cum laude graduate of Princeton University, winner of the Pine Prize, which is given to the most outstanding undergraduate, and a graduate of Yale Law School, where she was an editor of the Yale Law Journal. So that's a pretty impressive background. I wish I had a background quite as impressive as that. But when you were growing up, did you say that you wanted to be a lawyer? Was that clear from our early days that you wanted to be a lawyer?
Well, it was, but for reasons that weren't self evident. I grew up in a housing project in the South Bronx, and there were no lawyers or judges in the projects in which I lived. But when I was 7, I developed diabetes, and I understood back then, it's not so true now, but back then, if you had juvenile diabetes, which I did, you weren't permitted to become a law enforcement agent. And that's what I wanted to become, a detective, because of Nancy Drew. It was the first chapter books I began to read was at about 7.5 or 8 years old, and it was Nancy Drew. By the time I was 10, Perry Mason appeared on TV. And I know for those audience members who are closer in age to me and you, David, we all know who Perry Mason was. He was the first TV lawyer, and the first lawyer on which TV ran a weekly series. And from him, I learned of the work of lawyers. And I began to think about that as a potential alternative to being a detective, because Perry Mason spent the first half of his show investigating the crime his client was charged with, and the second half in court proving his client was innocent. And I thought, gee, that might marry the two skills that I really admire, that of playing sleuth to a mystery, and secondly, my penchant for liking to talk a lot.
So, for those who may not have watched Perry Mason, he had the advantage of always winning the case. He never lost.
No, he
And
lost once, believe it or not.
once,
Once. And
okay, he lost
where,
once,
mhm,
but he usually had the advantage of having the client or the person who was against him admitting in court that or she was wrong. In other words, he had the ability to bring the person to the point where the person said, I'm guilty. I did it. I'm sorry. That was a wonderful skill. When later I went to law school, I realized it doesn't really work that way so much.
I have to tell you, I've been a judge since I was 38 years old. I'm now 66 and a half. And it's never happened to me, and I've never read a transcript in which I've ever seen it happen at a trial. But that might be a point, David, as to why civic education, which is our subject tonight,
Right.
is so important. Because so many people don't realize what the purpose of a court proceeding is. We're not there really to find out if someone committed a crime or not. We're there to determine whether under the law, a prosecutor has proven that this particular defendant, beyond a reasonable doubt, has committed a particular crime. Those are two different purposes because one, the rule of law requires proof of a certain kind that meets a certain burden under the law and that shows that the person is guilty of the crime that the law says is a crime, not that which we might feel is moral guilt. And those are two big differences between, let us say, moral guilt. Have I done something wrong to you? And legal guilt, which is, have I done something that the law prescribes, that the law says I can't do to you?
Well, when you were growing up in the Bronx and in junior high school and high school, did you get very much civic education then? Did you feel that you learned a lot about the way our government works at that time?
Nothing. And I was an early product of the change in the country. When Sputnik was launched by Russia, the United States had an immediate visceral reaction that it was behind in technology and science from the Russians, and that we needed to catch up. And what started to happen after Sputnik in the 1960s is that the country became much more concerned with STEM education, as it should have been. It's an important issue that needed correcting in our country at the time. But one of the things that began to suffer was civic education. There's only a certain number of hours in a school day. And if you were going to load up more on STEM subjects, you had to reduce other subjects. And one of the casualties of that approach was civic education. And most schools began to forego civic education. And that, I think, was of great detriment to our country.
Now, when you became a member of the United States Supreme Court, Justice O'Connor, Sandra Day O'Connor, was already a member of the court, and you had a chance to get to know her. I'm just curious, did she talk about her interest in civic education? Because after she left the court, she really got much more involved in it. I wanted to hear from you, when did you get so interested in this as a justice of the court? Obviously, you have a lot of other things you're worried about, but as a justice on the court, did you focus on civic education as a result of your conversations with Sandra Day O'Connor?
When I joined the court, Sandra Day O'Connor had already taken senior status. She had stepped down from the court as an active member. As most people may know, she was the first female justice on the Supreme Court, and she was appointed in 1981. And it was a momentous time for me because I had just graduated from law school in 1979, 2 years earlier. And at the time, there were no women on the Supreme Court. There were no women on the highest court of my state, New York, the Court of Appeals. And women were still a fraction of the judges throughout the country, tiny, tiny fraction. When Sandra was appointed, it was such a beacon of hope for me. An idea formed in my head that my future wasn't limited the way I thought at first it might be, that I had potential to achieve other things in life besides just being a working lawyer, which is not unimportant, but that I could aspire myself to do something like becoming a judge eventually. When I got to the court, Sandra had taken senior status, and she had decided that there were two things she wanted to commit her senior status to. One was educating the public about the dangers of electing judges. She really thought that judges participating in elections could become unseemly, that they might be tempted to make promises to voters that they should not keep as a judge, because judges were required to keep an open mind in all cases. But the second, and probably the more important object of her education of the public, was in civic education. She had seen civic education decline in schools. She had also seen that civics was being taught in a really boring way. It was like, what are the three branches of government? Who's the president? Who's the vice president? How many senators are there? How many people in the House of Representatives? It was filled with facts, but not with understanding about what our civic process was about. And Sandra believed, having watched the decline of civic discourse in our country, that that was directly tied to the time in which civic education had declined in the US. And she actually did a study and spoke about the fact that if you correlated the decline of civic education in the United States, that this went down, civic education tracked it. I mean, civil discourse and its diminution tracked it, almost on cue with one another. And so she became committed to starting an organization called iCivics.org, which is devoted to teaching kids about civics and education in a creative and innovative way. It's doing it through game playing. And that's how it started its work. And it's reached over 7.5 million students, and over 120,000 teachers are using iCivics to engage kids in learning about our Republican form of government and about their role in participating in that government. Her involvement in teaching students through game playing dovetailed with my own aim of devoting my time on the Supreme Court to educating students on the importance of civic participation. You can't participate in something you don't know about. And so I tell students all the time, it's your obligation to learn about your system of government. But more importantly, it's your obligation not to let things happen to you as an individual, to be a bystander in life, but to become an active participant in understanding how you can better your community. And that's what civic participation is about. And you don't have to be a politician, and you don't have to be involved in politics, but you do have to be involved in improving the world you're in. And so those two, my aim and Sandra Day O'Connor's aim, went hand in hand. And that's why when she stepped down from active life, I joined the iCivics board.
Okay, so you're a member of the board now, and let me ask you today, in civics education, is the biggest problem in your view getting money from governments to fund programs in school, or is it getting students interested in this subject? What would you say is the biggest challenge you have right now?
I don't think, obviously, all efforts require resources. And so the lack of resources that we put into civic education is a significant problem. Right now in America, we spend $50 per student on STEM education and only 5 cents on civic education. That disparity is way off given how important civic education is to making better students. And there's a tremendous amount of social science research that show that students who become involved in civic education and in civic participation overall become better students. But I think the very first problem, and I think the most significant, is that I don't believe that our population, neither our government nor our citizens, understand the importance of civic education. There's one telling story that happened at the beginning of the country, and it involved Dr. Benjamin Franklin, who was coming out of the Constitutional Convention. And at the time, a woman stopped him and said, "Dr. Franklin, do we have a republic or do we have a monarchy?" And he said, "Madam, a republic, if you can keep it." And what he meant by that is that our Republican form of government doesn't survive without its citizens participating in it. Ignorance of what our laws mean, ignorance of what our society needs in terms of functioning and being vibrant is our biggest problem right now. We have to educate students, but in some ways we have to educate ourselves as adults and as citizens. And I don't mean citizens with a capital C. Are you a citizen of the United States? But are you what I call a citizen with a small c? Are you a citizen of your community? Do you understand that to keep it healthy, to keep it flourishing, we have to work together? And that's what civic involvement means, is figuring out ways to work together to make a more perfect union.
It's interesting that one of the only times in the United States where one has to actually know something about civics is if you're a naturalized citizen candidate. So was your mother a naturalized citizen?
No, well, no, because she was born in Puerto Rico, and under a 1917 law called the Jones Act, Puerto Ricans are born U.S. citizens as soon as they move to the mainland. So when she came over in World War II, she was considered and is an American citizen.
Right. So for those who are born, let's say, somewhere else, if you want to be a U.S. citizen, after roughly 5 years of residency, you have to take a citizenship test. I think there's 100 questions. You're asked 100 potential questions. You're asked, I think, 10 of them or something like that. You have to get 6 correct. Amazingly, 91% of the people who take it pass. But when the same test was given to native-born Americans not long ago, as you know, 49 out of 50 states, a majority failed. So sad situation.
That's a very sad situation. And David, one of the games on iCivics is an immigration game, and it teaches you how to become a citizen. You said 5 years of residency, but there are other ways, and the game will educate people on how to do that and teach them about so many other things, including how to run for president, what your rights are as a member of our society in the United States. Do I have a right? The game is called. If anyone's interested in playing our games and learning more about our country, play iCivic. Go to icivics.org and play our games. I will say something that I challenge almost every audience I speak to go on the website and play one game. And if you get 100%, you can stop playing. If you don't, keep playing the games until you learn more.
Okay. Well, I don't know if I want to take up that challenge because I'm not sure how well I would do, but I'll if I get 100%, I'll call you. Otherwise, I
All
won't
right.
mention. Okay. So let me ask you about what judges and justices do towards civic education, because in effect, for hundreds of years, judges have written opinions which explain why they made their decision. And I assume that's about, to some extent, civic education, explaining why you're coming up with the reasoning that you did to justify your decision. Is that how you look at that to some extent? Is it an education process, or it's slightly different than civic education?
It in There is a civic education component to judicial writing. We are explaining the reasons for why we're coming to our conclusions, and so that's always educational. And in particular, when you have a majority opinion and you have a dissenting opinion, you get to see two sides of the issue. And you get to see in writing how people can disagree about something, but still engage with each other's thinking. Um, and so that's an important educational process. But one of my colleagues, Justice Stephen Breyer, has written a book about making a democracy, in which he argues that our decision making is there to ensure that people continue to respect the judiciary, that our opinion writing is our way of explaining to the public why the law requires what it does, and to have the public accept our decisions as right. And so that is educational, but it serves another function. It serves the function of ensuring the legitimacy of the courts, that we are not a monarchy, that we are not making up rules, but that we are following the law as we, the justices, best understand it.
When our first president, George Washington, appointed the first Chief Justice, John Jay, I was surprised to read that he had so little to do in the first 2 years. He had no cases, that he was practicing law on the side and negotiating treaties on the side. Can you imagine how that possibly could get done today like that?
I don't think it would. But you do know, David, that he didn't want to become Chief Justice. He had to be talked into it. And if I understand the historical lore, he was placed in the position to get him out as competition for running for president in the future, which it didn't quite work long term. But the point is that, yes, at the beginning, at the very, very beginning, we were 13 colonies that had become 13 states. The amount of business for the court was very small. It was also difficult to do because you had to travel. To become a justice, you had to travel to the circuits, the different states by horseback. And so it was physically demanding as well. Over time, as the country grew, so did the legal problems. And with it, I think, so did the importance of the court.
So, as you were beginning your career and you graduated from Yale Law School, and then you became a prosecutor working for Robert Morgenthau at the beginning. How did that come about? Did you always want to be a prosecutor, or did you have a inspiration to just want to work for him?
Um, Perry Mason, going back to the TV show that was my motivation, my initial motivation for becoming a lawyer. In one episode, the long-suffering prosecutor who always lost to Perry Mason, Berger, met Perry at a restaurant after Perry Mason had proven his client innocent again or not guilty. At any rate, Perry said to Berger, I know how hard you worked on this case. It must feel a little frustrating to have lost to me. And Berger responded and said, yes, I worked hard on the case, but as a prosecutor, I am always seeking justice. And justice means for me that the persons who are guilty are proven guilty, and the people who are not guilty are let free. And you proved that the defendant was not guilty, and so justice was done. And I remembered those words by him when I went through law school. I wasn't planning then to become a prosecutor. I was following the path of most of my law school friends who were thinking of joining a law firm after law school. But in my third year, on a chance meeting with the then legendary Robert Morgenthau at Yale Law School, he invited me to come interview with him, which I did. And the rest is history, because I became convinced that maybe my original thought of becoming a prosecutor wasn't a bad idea.
But you wrote in your book, which was a bestseller a few years ago, about your life story, that it was a little complicated for you because you were often prosecuting people who came from the same type of neighborhoods that you did, and you kind of knew the families in effect, and it was a little difficult to kind of prosecute those people. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement. It was an emotionally difficult choice. Most of my friends who came from backgrounds like my own felt that people accused of crimes were often not treated fairly in the legal system. And so they thought that it might be inappropriate. They considered it inappropriate for me to think about becoming a prosecutor, that I should consider becoming a defense attorney. And I did think about their viewpoint, but I realized for myself that Paul Berger's statements, that what prosecutors do is seek justice, had to be my guiding light as a prosecutor. Those who were guilty should be prosecuted and treated fairly under the law and in accordance with the rules of law. And that those who were not guilty, that I had to work as hard to prove them not guilty. And so I was a prosecutor that had one of the highest records in my office for top count convictions, meaning the very top count, instead of plea bargaining it down, I would go to trial and prove those people guilty. But I also had a fairly high number of dismissal of cases where I thought that the proof was inadequate to prove the defendant guilty, but beyond a reasonable doubt. And I described some of those situations in my book. There is a misunderstanding about the role of lawyers in the judicial system. You're not favoring one side or another when you become a prosecutor or a defense attorney. Both prosecutors and defense attorneys are serving justice. We're both doing our job. The prosecutor represents the people of the state. The defense attorney represents the defendant. And each of us is ensuring that our legal system is properly working. And so we're really partners in a common pursuit. And too often people see us as enemies. And I think that's an attitude that should be changed by people.
Now, I practiced law for a few years in New York, and nobody ever called me up and said, you should be a judge someday. That never happened to me, and there's a good reason for that. I wasn't that good a lawyer. But when you practice law, eventually a number of people recommended you to be a judge. How does it occur that you get to be recommended for a judge? Who picks judges, federal judges? Is that picked by the senators? How did that come about?
Well, let me start. All federal judges are nominated by the President of the United States and confirmed by the Senate. When I say all federal judges, meaning district, circuit, and Supreme Court justices. We have magistrate judges and bankruptcy judges that are selected a different way. But in terms of what we call Article 3 of the Constitution, judges appointed under the Constitution, they're appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Every president has a slightly different way of picking their judges. For the very longest time, the way that it happens, and particularly in my state and in others, was that the president for district court judges, the trial level judges, would take recommendations from the senators of his state. I say his state because the presidents back then were all men, as they are to the current time. But senators of each state, particularly if they were of the same party as the president, could nominate people for the president to consider. If senators of a particular state were of the other party, then the president could or could not listen to their nomination. Out of courtesy, many people from other states who had different senators from a different party were still appointed. But in New York, there was an odd arrangement between the Republican and Democratic senators at the time I was nominated. Both Senator then D'Amato and Senator Moynihan had an agreement, which is if the president was a Republican, Senator D'Amato named or recommended 3 people, and Senator Moynihan won. And that became reversed if the president was a Democrat. Moynihan could nominate 3 people, and D'Amato won. I was one of Senator Moynihan's nominees under George Bush, the senior.
And so, as one of the nominees, I'm just curious, who actually interviews you? Do you get interviewed by the Attorney General or the senator? Who actually?
Again, you do get initially interviewed by the senator, and each senator has his or her own method of selecting people. Some senators, like Senator Moynihan, had a committee of lawyers and academics and other people community leaders, who interviewed people who were seeking nomination and asked them questions and then made recommendations to him. And I believe he interviewed a number of the people that they recommended. And he, in turn, would decide who he would nominate to the president. Other senators have different ways of doing it and rely on certain individuals or rely on certain staff members. So every senator does it slightly differently. And I'm not familiar with all 50 senator practices
Right.
today, but a lot of senators have review committees of some sort or another. Once the senator recommends you to the president, every president has a different committee that decide who's going to review each nominee. And it's generally someone from the Department of Justice. It's generally one or more people from the White House counsel's office, or it could just be an advisor that the president trusts with respect to nominations. So again, every president selects his or her own method of selecting who they will nominate.
And how does the Court of Appeals work? Is that slightly different?
That is slightly different because, as a matter of course, historically, presidents will consider the views of senators, but only consider them, meaning their priority is different for Court of Appeals. There are many less Court of Appeal judges. There's only less than 200 or about 200 Court of Appeals judges, and there's about 700 or 800 district court judges. And so for the Court of Appeals, again, every president has a committee of some sort within the White House made up of people from different departments of White House counsel's office, Department of Justice, advisors of various kinds. And they get together and usually supply recommendations to the president.
And you were appointed by President Clinton?
By President Clinton to the Court of Appeals.
Yes. So is it unusual to have somebody who's a Republican president appoint you to one position and then a Democratic president appoints you to another position? Isn't that relatively unusual?
Very unusual. There's only a handful of people who have had that, of judges and justices who have had that happen in their careers.
So when you were appointed to the judgeship initially, the federal district court judgeship, I assume you told your mother about it, and I assume she said terrific things, but did you actually tell her how low the compensation is to be a judge?
Yes, and I'll tell you the story, David. Senator Moynihan gave me permission to tell my parents that he was going to send my name to the president. He asked me to wait before making a public announcement until he first announced it. But he gave me permission to tell my mother and my then stepfather. They came to my home. I was living then in Brooklyn, and I told them, Ma, Senator Moynihan is going to appoint me to the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. And she knew I was excited, and has been my mother's custom her entire life. Every time I get excited, she gets excited. She doesn't know what's happening, but she gets excited. And she didn't know what was happening then. And she said to me, that is wonderful. You're going to make a lot more money, aren't you? And I looked at her and I said, Mommy, no, I'm going to make less money. I'm going to take a pay cut. Judges don't make as much as practicing lawyers. And I won't get raises for a very long time. And in fact, I had to be on the court, David, for more than 15 years before I got my first raise. At any rate, she then looks at me and she says, okay, that's all right, but you're going to travel as much as you do now, right? My practice had consisted of international commercial litigation, and I had some very famous clients in Europe and around the world. And so I had traveled extensively in private practice. And my response to her was, well, Mommy, no. My office will be in downtown Manhattan in a courtroom. And I really won't travel from that courtroom. People come to me for me to hear their cases as a judge. So I can see her wheels turning in her head, and she looks at me and she says, okay, but you're going to meet and befriend as many interesting people as you do now, right? You know all these famous fashion designers, all of these people involved in wonderful industries around the world, and they'll become your friends too. And I looked at her and I said, "No, mommy. The people who come before me want me to be impartial, so I can't become friendly with them. And so, no, I won't have the same kinds of relationships I had before." She finally looked at me and said, after pondering this for a few seconds, "So, why are you taking this job?" And interestingly enough, her husband, Omar, said, "Selena, you have to know that if Sonia's excited and she wants to do it, it's because it's something important to do and that she will help people doing it." And so my stepfather answered for me. And my mom looked at him and said, "You're right. I should know that." And so it's a perfect explanation of my mother being excited for me, but not always fully understanding why.
But by the time you were nominated to be on the Supreme Court, at that point, um, she recognized it was a great honor, I assume. And with the Supreme Court, everybody gets an interview with the President of the United States. And how do you prepare for an interview with the President of the United States for an associate justice position? Is that all night, stay up all night preparing, or what do you do?
Well, what I did was I called a bunch of friends who I knew had been involved in other administrations to ask them the kinds of questions that were tended to be asked during this process. Now, this was a different president. And so it was President Obama, and this was his first nomination. So no one could tell me what questions his people were likely to ask. But I understood that there was a process and that there was a likelihood that some questions would be the same over different presidential administrations. I then sent out an email to my family of law clerks, and I had over 70 of them at the time, and asked them to think of questions I might be asked and to think of issues that I should consider and to provide me with any reading materials that they thought might be helpful to prepare me. I called up some professor friends who were wonderful and asked them to just make a list for me of the issues that they thought were currently most important before the Supreme Court. I knew what I thought was important, but academics are studying it from a different angle. And so I thought, let me get the academics to tell me what they think is important. And so the preparation is the way it should be for any job you undertake. You should be looking at what others have, what talking to other people who have gone through the process, understanding what the job entails before you go in for an interview, and thinking about what your position is on issues that might arise.
So, when you were interviewed by a man who had been the president of the Harvard Law Review, did you tell him why you decided not to go to Harvard Law School and why you went to Yale Law School?
He never asked, believe it or not.
Okay.
He never asked. He did say that the one thing about me that he almost held against me was that I was a Yankees fan.
Yes, he was a Chicago Cubs fan, I
Cubs
guess.
fan, exactly.
So there was a famous picture of you being sworn in. I think your mother is holding a Bible, family Bible, and she's there. So, what's it like to have your mother see you being sworn in on the Supreme Court?
There is nothing more amazing in one's life than to live further than your dreams. As I explained to you, when I was a child, I never dreamt of being a lawyer, never mind about being a Supreme Court justice. I didn't know what that was. And to achieve a point in my life where I had finally lived beyond my dreams and achieved something so extraordinary, and being given the gift of sharing that with the most important person in my life, my mother, it was such a deeply, deeply felt moment. Most of us don't have the privilege of having parents alive at the end of our careers or at points in our career where we achieve the most. And so I am eternally grateful that my mom was there.
So the salary you get as an associate justice of the Supreme Court is not all that much higher than the salary you got many years ago as a federal district judge. Why do you think it is that, to be honest, there's so little corruption in federal judiciary system when people are paid so little money? And why are so many people still interested in being judges? Is it because they really want to serve their country? I assume money is just not relevant in those instances.
Well, that's absolutely true. When you are asked to serve, there is a moral compulsion to serve your country. And to be a federal judge is service as a lawyer, the most service that you can do for your country. You ask a very important question, and I have many lectures in which I've talked about judicial ethics. In our country, we take for granted that we have the lowest amount of judicial corruption in the world. And why is that? We don't pay our judges enough. We pay our federal judges very little. We pay most of our state judges even less. Now, one could always point to a few corruption cases that have been prosecuted. But by and large, we are in the world the most respected judicial system. And I think that's because, as a nation, we insisted on that level of commitment to the rule of law. And I remember being in Botswana visiting a few years ago. And I remember asking one of his citizens why there was so little corruption in Botswana. And he said, because our first king of Botswana set an example in which he said that our government officials were there to serve the people, and that we as the people should expect no less. And we, the people in Botswana, expect our government to work for us, and we won't tolerate corruption. And I don't know that we've had, as an Americans, have actually understood that that expectation is one that we have inculcated in our culture. It's taken over 230 years of our existence as a nation for us to say, if you become a judge, you have both an ethical, legal, and moral obligation to serve. And so, yes, despite the lack of money, we don't need it because what we have is the pride of service.
So, Justice Sotomayor, we're almost out of time. I would just have two final questions for you. First is the question of relating to civic education. If people want to do more for civic education, what can they do? What can somebody do and says, yes, I understand your message. I'd like to do more. What can an average person do?
Well, first of all, educate yourself. Go to idecivics.org and learn the games so that you learn about civic participation. But secondly, in virtually all states today, there are campaigns going on in which aimed at increasing civic education in local schools. Florida, for a few years back in 2010, after an impassioned speech by Sandra Day O'Connor, started a civics education program that has been highly successful. You can't graduate from I think it's either middle school or high school in Florida, unless you can pass that immigration test, David. It's a simple measure, but a very important one in having institutionalized civics education in Florida. There are other states like Massachusetts and Illinois and the state of Washington and others, including New York and many others, that have campaigns going on to increase civic education in state school systems. Everybody across the United States should learn more about what those programs are in their individual states. There are also national programs occurring. iCivics is leading one called American Democracy, Educating for American Democracy. And it's a national program that is looking at establishing a national model of civic education. And there's a website for it, and I encourage people to look at it and think about the various programs that are being described there. There are so many different ways to participate. I tell people it's not just simply politics. There are ways of participating in your community that involve service in so many different ways. So you don't have to be an outgoing political figure. You just have to be a person who cares. And if you care and look online, you will find a whole host of different programs in which you can become and show you are a concerned participant.
The final question is, suppose somebody is watching you and says, I want to be Sonia Sotomayor when I grow up. I want to be a leader. I want to be a great justice. What are the one or two attributes that you would recommend to young women and to young men that they develop if they really want to become a leader as they get older?
Passion. You have to, that's the first quality. To become a leader, you have to show people that you care deeply about things. People only follow those who they think are passionate. And so you have to possess passion. And then second, commitment driven by dedication and hard work. You don't get anywhere unless you work hard. I tell kids all the time, think of every sports athlete that you admire. They didn't wake up when they were a child to be a star. They had to work at it. Every basketball star you know has been on the court for hours, days, months, and years practicing that throw shot. You have to work hard to achieve anything in this life. And so you have to have perseverance and dedication and a sense of commitment to working hard to doing things right.
Well, let me conclude by saying thank you for your time. And I just want to conclude, and for everything you're doing and for civics education and for what you're doing for the judiciary system and for being a great role model. I'll tell one final story about your role model to me in this sense. One time you and Skip Gates and I had dinner together. And when the bill came, I reached to get it, figuring, okay, I can certainly afford dinner for 3 people. And you said, no, you cannot let anybody pay for a dinner for you. So you had to pick up the check for the 3 of us because you were so concerned that somebody would think that a business person had bought a dinner for you and it was an inexpensive dinner. So I remember that dinner very well because it was the only time a justice of the Supreme Court actually treated me to a dinner. So thank you very much for doing that. And thank you for this conversation, and good luck to you.
Thank you, David.
Hello, I'm David Rubenstein, and we're here at Mount Vernon, George Washington's famous home, and we're here with another famous general, Colin Powell, who served as a 4-star general, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Secretary of State. Colin, thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you very much, David. I've been here before, and I've been with you many times before, so I'm looking forward to our time.
We've had events here.
Yep.
So as we sit here today in this incredible house, it was bought many years ago, over 100 years ago, by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. This association has bought it, and now they operate it, but they have no men on their board. Do you imagine how anything can work in this world without men on a board? Do you imagine how this could possibly happen?
They have demonstrated that to us for the last couple of 100 years almost now. And they've done a great job. They've raised money. They've kept the place looking absolutely beautiful. And I think you would not be successful if you tried to get on the board.
I think that's probably true. And I also wonder whether, think about this, we've had 200 plus years of men as presidents of the United States. Have you ever thought what would happen if a woman became president of the United States? Do you think a woman could be a leader as good as the men we've had?
David, that is such a sucker question. The answer I give you is there's no reason they can't be. I mean, we see them moving up day after day. The Supreme Court, within the Senate, within the House, in cabinet positions, they're slowly moving up. And now we have a vice president of the United States to be, who is in line to be the president if something happens or if she runs for it. So the answer to the question is women are coming along in a way that I never would have anticipated. We got 4-star female generals all over the place. And you better treat them like 4 stars, not that they're female 4 stars. So I think we've come a long way in the last couple hundred years, but especially in the last 50 years, when we really started pressing on this. I remember once when I was a battalion commander at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, 101st Airborne Division, and we'd run every morning. And we sometimes had some paratroop songs that we sang from the old days. And one morning, my battalion commander, my brigade commander, spotted me running with my troops and using some language that perhaps was not appropriate for that, because there was a women's formation right behind me. We still had women's formations. And so later that day, he called me aside and said, "Don't ever use language like that anymore in the division." And I never did. It took me a while to clean it all up, but I'm in pretty good shape.
So we're going to talk about leadership today, and something you know a great deal about. But let's talk about when you started out your career. You went to CCNY, City College of New York, where there's now a college named after you.
Yes.
And it's operating and have, what, 6,000 students in it?
That's 6,000, yes.
Okay. And I assume you've done many things of which you're proud, but I assume you're very proud that a city college is named a college after you.
Well, it's not quite an entire college. It's sort of a part of a college, but it's about a third of a college. And it was done because when I got there, after I left the State Department, retired from government, I went up there and somebody had endowed some money to the small little think tank that we had. So it was very interesting for a while. You were helpful at that point, David, as well. After a while, I said, I don't need another think tank. I want a place where young students can come and we can give them an education, but the education they're getting, they have to take out into the community and use. So we're teaching them. That's why they call, global leadership, service and leadership. And the academic part is part of that. And so these kids really went crazy over it. I mean, they really love it. And it went from just a small think tank of maybe 30 or 40 kids, now to about 6,000.
Now, the children that go there, the young people that go there, are they the children of private equity people or hedge fund people or people who've been around colleges for a long time or not?
No, they were like me. They were immigrant kids. Not all. Many of them are, were born there and they have parents who are very solid parents. But it really is an immigrant college. And all the youngsters I knew when I went there 60 or 70 years ago, they came from an immigrant background. There were a lot of Jewish kids who were there. That's how I learned how to speak a little Jewish. It helped me a great deal in my adult life. And because you just saw these immigrant kids who are working at it. I look at my immigrant parents. I mean, my mother didn't finish, she finished high school, my father did not. I had cousins all over the place. My sister was sent off to school in Buffalo and became a teacher. And nobody knew exactly what I was going to do. It was causing a great deal of distress within the family. And then I finally finished with a C average, beautiful C average, the undergraduate stuff, the high school and all that. And I wanted to go somewhere. And my mother said, you must apply to the Bronx High School of Science and to Stuyvesant, the two top high schools in New York City. And, okay, Mom, if that's what you want me to do. So I applied and they wouldn't accept me. And the counselor said, no, you're not ready for anything like this. So I went to Morris High School where they had to let you in. There was no constraints on letting you in. And that's all I was able to do. It was a good time being shut down because I was not really for what they were offering. So I went to City College of New York. I got in there somehow with another C average. And then something happened at the end of the second semester. I saw ROTC cadets marching around the school. And I realized, hey, that's pretty cool. So I joined ROTC. The ROTC faculty made it clear to me that you got to do it our way. We don't believe in C's. You got to get A's in everything we give you. And then we'll see where you go. Well, I went pretty high within ROTC. I became the commandant of the school for all the students who were there in ROTC. And then I went into the Army in 1958, still a segregated country for the most part. And they were a little nervous about me going there. The professor of military science at CCNY wanted to make sure that I knew, now that I was going to the South, you know, Fort Bragg, places like that, that I understood the social changes I would face. And I understood it, and I got along fine, and I did well as a young lieutenant. I never thought I would get far beyond that. Maybe I get promoted to major at some point, but that was all I asked for.
And you never thought you'd be the 4-star general or chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I assume?
I have a joke with this one. I tell people come up to me and say, you know, now that I am a 4-star, or was a 4-star, they'd come up and say, well, did you go to West Point? No. Did you go to one of the schools down south, you know, the Citadel or one of those? No. Where did you go? CCNY. What's that? City College of New York, that's it. And you became a 4-star general. Did you ever dream you'd become a 4-star general? And that's when I have the punchline. I said, yeah, there I was. I was growing up in the South Bronx and then in Harlem, both. And when I was in the South Bronx, a second educational experience, there I was. I was on the corner of 163rd and Kelly Street one day and said to myself, you know what? I was about 12 years old. You're going to grow up and become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Everybody breaks out into laughter. I laughed the loudest. It was unthinkable. I mean, we're talking about a point in time in this country where segregation still existed. It had just ended for the military, but it still existed for the whole country. And I just did the very best I could. And what my NCOs, sergeants, told me when I got there, and was, you know, trying to adjust to it all, they made it clear. They said, you know, Lieutenant Powell, we don't care what color you are. We don't care where your parents came from. We don't care what school you graduated from. The only thing we care about is your performance. And from your performance, we want to see what your potential is. You understand? Yes, Sergeant, I understand. Good. Now, get out there and do it. And that's what I did for the next 30 years.
But for some time, you were stationed in the South, where on the bases, you were treated like you were a white person.
Yep.
But when you left the bases to get something to eat or do something else, you weren't treated very well. Is that right?
Yeah, it happened after I had gotten married and gone off to Vietnam early on when it was just starting up. And I came back from that tour. I'd been away for a whole year. Hadn't seen the wife I had known for a few months. Now she's my wife for a year I haven't seen. And there's a baby, this little boy named Michael, who I'd never met. And there they were. And so one night I was looking for a house for us. And as I came through Columbus, Georgia, which is the other side of Fort Benning, Georgia, but it was a city, not part of the post. I went up to a store to order a hamburger because I was hungry. And I went right to the front where there's a counter. I knew I couldn't go inside. And the young woman who was behind the counter asked what I was doing. And I said, can I have a hot dog or a hamburger or something? And she said, no, I don't think so. I said, I just got back from Vietnam. Can I? She said, I'm so sorry. I'm from New Jersey. I don't understand any of this, but I cannot serve you. I'll take you around the back and get you something. I said, no, thanks. And then I left, went back half a mile to the post, got a hamburger, got it anytime I wanted. And then about 6 months later, just about July 4th of 1964, the Accommodations Act was signed. And I went down to that place and said, hot dog, please. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. You got it. No problem. Had Alma with me at the time. And that was the beginning of the end of segregation. It was the beginning of the end of accommodations, restrictions. And what I've often said to people, we just didn't release black people from a problem. We released white people from a problem. This was a problem for both of us. And so I took that attitude into my career. One thing led to another. I went to Vietnam again a second time. Went to Korea. That was the third time away from my family in a period of less than 12 years. And I just kept moving up.
But did you ever think to yourself, you had prepared to give the last full measure of devotion to this country?
Oh, yeah.
and you were injured in Vietnam, do you ever say to this person when you came back, you know, I was prepared to give my life for this country, and now you won't serve me a hot dog or a hamburger? How did you resist the temptation to say that?
You didn't want to get in trouble. And I didn't want to fight with this lady. She didn't know why she was there. She was just following it. And I knew I was coming back right after the Accommodations Act was signed. It was in process then. That's the way it panned out. Except she tried to help me. She said, are you one of the African-American students here at Fort Benning? No. Are you a Puerto Rican? No. Are you yes, I'm Black. That's it. I can't serve you. So I'll be back.
So you rose up eventually to become a 4-star general. Did either of your parents live to see that event?
4-star, no. My only parent who saw me get promoted to general was my mother, and she saw me promoted to 1-star.
What did she say? She said, I knew that was always going to happen?
No. But what was amusing about it all is that the whole family wanted me to get out of the Army. All my relatives. And so the way they said that there's only one thing to do, have Aunt Larice talk to him. Aunt Larice was kind of, the senior person in the family. And so she invited Alma and me, my wife, to lunch one day. And she was just lecturing us something awful. You've been hurt twice. Every time you went over there to Vietnam, you got hurt. You're in a helicopter crash. You fell in a pit hole. We're worried that if you go back again, you'll die. They'll kill you. And you got to leave now. And I said, Larice, you don't understand. I'm a professional soldier. I can't leave. This is what I do. This is where I go. This is my profession. And she still wasn't persuaded. So I said, oh, did I tell you that, Larice, when I have gotten 20 years in, and I'm about 41 years of age, 20 years in, I can retire. And they'll pay me full retirement pay for the rest of my life. And in typical immigrant fashion, she said, stay, it's a good deal, stay. And I did.
Well, you rose up, and one day you get a call from a friend of yours, Frank Carlucci, who said, I'd like you to come back. I just named the National Security Advisor to President Reagan, and I want you to come back to be the Deputy National Security Advisor. And you were in Germany, I think, at the time. And you said, well, I like my job now. I'm commanding soldiers. But ultimately, he said, well, I really want you. And you said, the President of the United States wants me. He should call me. And what happened?
It was one of the dumbest things I've ever done in my life. How could I have ever believed that I had said the president has to call me? And I was just desperate. I was in a beautiful Corps headquarters, a monstrous room, twice as large as this room. And I was going to be in a little room this big in one of the smallest sections of the White House. And I really wanted to stay with troops. I'd been pulled out of troops before for these jobs in the Pentagon or in the White House. And so when Frank Carlucci, who had taken me out of assignments before, told me that, Iran-Contra, we got to have you back. I've just become the National Security Advisor. I need you here. I said, Frank, come on, you're doing it to me again. I need you here, and the president wants you here. And then I did one of the dumbest things I've ever done in my life, as if I didn't know what the answer was. So I said, well, if I'm that important, why doesn't the president call? And as I walked away from the phone, I said, oh, you dumb SOB. And about 15 minutes later, the phone rings. Hello? Oh, General Powell, how are you? This is Ronald Reagan. Yes, sir. And I stood at attention in my kitchen, my underwear, my jammies. And I said, yes, Mr. President. He said, we really need you back here. Yes, sir, we're on the way. That's all you can do as a soldier. And it turned out to be a turning point in my whole life, my whole career.
So you later became, when Frank became Secretary of Defense, you became the National Security Advisor for Ronald Reagan at the end of his term. And then later, you went back to the military in terms of commanding troops. But then you get appointed by George Herbert Walker Bush to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Did you ever think that was going to happen?
No. Why should I? I'm just some immigrant kid. Well, some immigrants out of the South Bronx and Harlem. I wasn't expecting that. But I fell into a great relationship with not only Frank, but with then Vice President Bush, but especially with President Reagan. And the way it happened, we were having a meeting in the Situation Room. And I was chairing the meeting because Frank wasn't there. I didn't know where Frank was, the National Security Advisor. And the president wasn't there. And so Schultz was there and all the other major cabinet members were there. And so I'm presiding over it, which I did regularly. And then suddenly Frank walks in and sits down on that side of the table. And right behind him is President Reagan. He's sitting at the end of the table. So I'm wondering quite what happened. And so Frank scribbles a note out to me. And he passes it down the table to me. And I open up this little piece of paper note. And it says, "You are now the National Security Advisor." Nobody asked me, Frank. I wasn't interviewed. So what? We know you. That was the end of it. And this Army, no more Army for then. I did that for a total of 2 years, Deputy and National Security Advisor. President Reagan and I formed a great relationship, as I did with Vice President Bush. And so came to the end, and Frank's gone off, and so I'm free. I can get back to the Army. Not so fast. And so I stayed for a while longer. And finally, I was able to break free of the White House and go back to the Army. I told all of them, I'm not retiring from the Army out of the White House. I got to retire from the Army to get out of the Army. And so that's what I want to do. I want to go back to the Army. Bush, when he became president, elected president, he did something that was rather unusual. It was about 2 days after his election. We had offices right next to each other, separated only by a bathroom. So he called me in. I said, what's he calling me? And so he said, I want to offer you a couple of jobs. And he offered me 3 jobs in the highest positions in the government. And I said, thank you. Let me go home and talk to my wife about it, Alma. And I went home, barely spoke to her about it because I didn't want any of the jobs. I wanted to go back to the Army. And so I went and spoke to the Chief of Staff of the Army and said, do you have anything for me if I come back? And I've really been screwing around a lot of different places. He said, no, we got a place for you. So the next morning I went into the Oval Office and the President was there, and I said, Mr. President and Mr. Vice President, the Army does want me back. Thank you very much, but I got to go back to the Army. And Reagan kind of looked over and said, does that include 4 stars? And I said, yes, Mr. President, I'm going to get a 4th star. He said, oh, that's good. And that was it. I got my 4th star, took command of 1 million soldiers with a headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. And that lasted maybe 4 months. And I got a call that said, we want you to come see the new Secretary of Defense. That was Cheney. And he said, the president wants you to become the chairman. President Bush now. I said, I'm the junior 4-star. You know, there are 15 4-stars, and I'm number 15. And I've only been a 4-star for about 3 months. Yeah, what's your point? I said, well, yeah, okay. And then so he reported that to the president. And he came back and said, the president has 2 questions. 1, can you do it? No infantry officer will ever say, no, I can't do it. I said, yes, I can do it. And then he said, are you worried about having everybody junior to you? Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, they were all junior to me. I'd only been a 4-star for a few months. And I said, it's not a problem, Mr. President, Mr. Carlucci, or Mr. now Cheney. I said, it's not a problem. We're professionals. And it never was a problem. It got along great.
So the general public maybe didn't know you as well as people in Washington did, but they got to know you because Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and you were given the task of figuring out how, with Norman Schwarzkopf, the general of CENTCOM then, to figure out how to get him out of Kuwait. Were you ever worried that that wasn't going to work out as successfully as we ultimately found it out to be?
When we finally got the plan put together, Norm and I were satisfied with it, and we briefed the leadership. We went more than we ever would need. So I was not the least bit worried about it. I didn't know how many casualties we'd take. But I went and said to President Bush, I said, Mr. President, I will tell you something. There's no question about how this war is going to turn out. Don't worry about it. I don't know how many casualties we'll have, but we'll beat them. They don't know what they're doing out there. The Iraqis have just dug themselves into a little circle or a little U-shaped formation, and they weren't moving. So they were just asking us to knock them out, and we did. We did it, and we got a lot more troops in the region than we might have needed. 500,000 Americans and about 200,000 allies. It was a given. I mean, it was over. And we didn't want to fight a war. The president said, send Secretary Jim Baker over to talk to the Iraqis to say, you don't want to do this. We didn't want a war. We just want you to give that land back to Kuwait and give it back to Kuwait. By then, though, we couldn't avoid a war. We didn't want to avoid a war because we were ready for it.
At the time, there were predictions when the Senate was voting on whether we should go to war, get approval to do this from the Senate, that we would have 10,000 American casualties. How many did we ultimately get?
It was about 400, and 200 of those were accidents, friendly injuries. Norm and I were thinking it might be in the neighborhood of 5,000. Some of the big shots in Washington were saying it was going to be 15, 20,000. We're catching a lot of heck from different parts of the Congress and a number of experts. But I knew it wouldn't be that large, but I couldn't be sure. So Norm and I talked about it very often. And we thought maybe at worst it'd be around 5,000. It turned out to be 300 or so military casualties by the enemy and another 300 killed by their accidents or our accidents.
Now, there's something called the Powell doctrine, which I don't think you called it that, but other people did, which said if you're going to go to war, have massive support and massive number of troops. Is that fair to call it the Powell doctrine? Is that what you said? It have a massive amount of troops?
It's perfect except for one thing. It was the invention of a reporter.
Right.
Reporter came to see me when I was chairman. We had just won the Gulf War, Desert Storm. And he sat down in my office and was asking how we did it and this, that, and the other. And he says, well, give me a simple expression of, of your theory, the Powell theory, the Powell way of doing it. And I said, well, it's not written in any manual. He said, yeah, but I'm going to write about it. You are? You're going to invent it? He says, yeah, it's going to call the Powell doctrine. And I said, well, in a nutshell, here's what it is. Make sure you've looked at the politics of it. You've looked at the diplomacy of it. You know what you're getting into. And then if you can't find a diplomatic way to get out of it, and you have to go to war, then you go to war with an overwhelming force. I don't use the term overwhelming. I just say decisive force, meaning you will prevail. You will win. We did it in Panama. We did it in several other places. And then Desert Storm came along, and that's exactly what we did.
Well, eventually you retired from the military, and you published a book on your life story, which was a bestseller, needless to say. But it was so popular that people said, well, the author of this book, maybe he should run for president himself. And you did look at it. Why did you not run for president in 1996?
Because I was not a politician, and I wasn't meant to be a politician. I thought about it for about 2 weeks because I was getting such pressure. And I realized, you know what, this isn't you. You're a soldier. You can't be a politician. You're a good politician, but as long as you're not one. I was not bad in sorting out political issues. But when I faced a military problem, I always had to look at both sides and not just, it's going to be this way. I always had to study both. And I had spent over 35 years at that point just being a soldier. And so I gave it serious thought. And then one morning I woke up, put my feet on the floor of the bedroom. I shook my head and said, this is not you. This is not you. And so I went downstairs to see my wife, Alma, who was in the kitchen. And I said, Alma, I'm not going to do it. So I'm giving a press conference tomorrow, which says I'm not going to run for political life. And she just looked at me and said, what took you so long? She knew that I would not do it. And what she also knew, I think, is that if I wanted to do it and she didn't want to do it, I wouldn't have done it.
So when you're the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, you're four-star general, and you say to your wife you want to do something and she disagrees, who wins?
Depends on what the issue is. If it's what movie we're going to see, I might prevail. But if it was, going to war or something like that, or running for political office, that was not in the game for her.
So you eventually went back into government service, and another doctrine was named after you, the Pottery Barn Doctrine. And this came about when you came back as Secretary of State. And when you became Secretary of State under George W. Bush, eventually he wanted to invade Iraq. And you apparently told him, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, by the way, if you go in there and you break it, you own it, like the Pottery Barn. Now, the Pottery Barn people, did they like that? Or was
No, they didn't. And it was another reporter, another journalist got me into that one. And I never said that, but one of your colleagues in the press did say it, and it made news. Pottery Barn, what a great line, And so everybody started blaming me. And so I didn't, the theory is right, but the line is not something I made up. It was just made up by a reporter. I said, it's a pretty good line though, I'm making money on this one. And so I accepted it. It's not in any military magazine, not in any military manual. You will not find it, except among the troops. They still like it. And people said, well, did you come up with this theory out of nowhere? I said, no. If you look carefully at it, you'll find it goes back to the days of Chinese imperialism. It goes back to Clausewitz. It essentially says, if you're going to go to war, make sure you have tried every alternative to satisfy your political objective without going to war. And if you are faced with an enemy who is determined to fight you, then make sure you have put together a force that will win.
So for much of your public career, there was a thing called bipartisanship, where Republicans and Democrats actually would come together and maybe pass bills together, talk together, socialize together. That seems to have gone by the wayside. Do you have any reasonable hopes that with the new administration coming in, bipartisanship can come back, or you think it's a day it's come and gone?
Well, in the first point, you're absolutely right. I had a lot of arguments over political issues. How much money do we give to Nicaragua? All kinds of things. But it was always with people who could argue back. And we would argue as balanced arguments. Right now, we don't have that kind of government. And I'm not quite sure what will happen in the remaining time for this government. And I have a hunch the president-elect, Mr. Biden, when he becomes president, will be more inclined toward that way of doing business. The current president, and during his term, he didn't see it that way. And so we were busy getting out of agreements, shooting out at things, and I don't think it served us well.
So although you are a registered Republican, and you have voted for Republicans, and you announced that you were a Republican when you were thinking of maybe running for president, you supported President Obama when he was running, and you supported Joe Biden when he was running, and I think you supported Hillary Clinton when she was running.
I think so, yeah.
Right? So have you ever thought of maybe becoming a Democrat? You've supported a number of Democratic candidates, and
No, I had a better idea. I live in the state of Virginia where you are not registered as anything. You just decide what you want to do that term. And so I have also voted for Lyndon Johnson. So I have voted for both Republicans and Democrats. And when I'm asked about it, especially my children ask me about it, I say, examine both sides. See which makes the most sense to you. See which one you think is right for the country. And then that's who you vote for. I don't know any other way to do it properly. And I've always tried to do it properly. The scariest time I ever had was in Alabama one time after I'd gotten back from Vietnam. And still, segregation was still the system in that part of the world, Sylacauga, Alabama. And so I was driving a Volkswagen, German car. And I came through Sylacauga and a cop was waiting, state trooper. He pulled me over. And he looked at my license and my license plate, and he came back to me and he said, I've noticed that you got this little German car. I also noticed that you got an all the way with LBJ sticker on the side of it, and you got a New York license plate. Son, you need to get out of here as fast as you can. Yes, sir. And it's the way it was.
So George Washington, who built this house and lived here for many, many years, of course, he passed away at the age of 67. Can you imagine what it was like to be the general in the Revolutionary War with very few troops fighting against the best army in the world? If you had ever had a chance to meet with George Washington, what would you like to have asked him?
I would like to have asked him, how did you analyze these situations? I mean, how did you decide to take a chance here? He was a remarkable soldier, and he lost quite a few battles, and he kept coming back. And he's been in different parts of the Army and different sections of the security system. But he improved with each exercise. And he never lost faith in himself. And he never lost faith in the country he was doing it for. And so that was remarkable. Would I be the same kind of person? I have always tried to be the same kind of person, although never with the kind of situations he was facing. And what the British didn't know is that he had the country. You know, British were far away from home, and that was a disadvantage. So the president could always, at the time, our president at the time, George Washington, if he got trapped, he could always move to somewhere, go off to New Jersey or somewhere else and just reassess his situation and bring the troops back and then train them and get help. French helped, the Germans helped. And finally, he overwhelmed them. And the British had to give up. Yorktown.
So as an African American, what has been your view of the Black Lives Matter movement? And how do you think people should look at George Washington? He was our first president, the leader of the Revolutionary War, but he was a slave owner. So do you think we should still honor people like George Washington, even though they were slave owners? And do you think that the Black Lives Matter movement will change racial relations in the foreseeable future?
I think Black Lives Matter is a reasonable statement of the situation we are in now. But I also say to my audiences, Black Lives Matter, but you want to know something? All lives matter. And so we have to think about all Americans. Black Lives Matter is resting on sound ground, but I just can't look at Black Lives Matter. I have to look at White Lives Matter too. It's like I told you earlier, I have to look at all sides of an issue. We'll face this up. I think things are improving. You know, how the devil did I ever become Secretary of State or a four-star general or commander of the largest group of soldiers in the United States Army? It's because I demonstrated professionalism and I demonstrated, you know, potential. And so in my talks to young people, and I do a lot of that, or my school at City College, New York, I always tell them, you've got to do your very, very best. And you have got to make sure that you are also showing potential. Because people say, well, how did you become, you know, how did you get promoted to 4 stars? I said, just did the best I could. And guess what? They never promised me anything. They never promised me 4 stars. The only thing they asked me to do, wanted me to do, and I did, was every night when I went home, I said to myself, did you have a good day today as a soldier? And as I became more senior, I would answer it this way, you know, they're my soldiers, I have to take care of them. I've got to be the best I can be. Did I make mistakes? Yes. Did I screw things up? Yes. Was I criticized by my superiors? Occasionally. But that's part of growing up. And I teach young people. One school I went to in Japan once, and a young student raised her hand and said, have you ever failed at anything, General? I said, yeah. Do you ever, you know, are you ever afraid? She said, yes. I said, you can't live without being afraid of something at some point, at some time, and you will fail. You have to fail. It's part of living. I failed. The question is, what do you do about it? And the answer I give to so many audiences is that you figure out what you failed about and what to do, how to fix yourself, not to start pointing fingers at people. You might have to do that to a couple of people, but what you really have to do is figure out, what did you miss? What did you do wrong? And fix yourself. And then once you have looked at that failure and you've corrected yourself and the rest of the organization, don't ever touch it again. A lot of people come up and say, oh, well, you know what happened to me in 1952? I said, I don't care what happened to you in 1952. What happened to you last year? And have you fixed it? You know, and was I afraid? Sure. My first night in combat, first day in combat in Vietnam, we were going down a trail, and I was about the third person in the column, and suddenly fire broke out. Bullets were flying everywhere. And when we got over it, the guy who was two people in front of me, a Vietnamese soldier, was dead. He was killed. And we had to wrap him in a poncho and carry him around for a couple of days till we can get a helicopter to get him out. But that night, as I went to bed, or went to my, blanket, I said to myself, oh my God, they're going to do this again tomorrow. And they did. And you just had to learn to deal with fear. Fear is a natural, it's a natural thing in you. And so you have to learn about how to deal with failure and how to deal with fear. And I worked on that for a long time, and my failures sometimes held me back. I was not always, going straight up. I had a habit of telling people what I thought, and I would get in trouble occasionally. One of my bosses said to me, you spoke too much the other day. I said, I have to. I'm the military advisor to the president. I cannot ignore what I felt and thought that he ought to know and feel. Chew me out, go ahead. But you've got to hear what I believe in.
So if the President of the United States called you, President-elect Biden, as we talk today, and said, I need some advice on how to bring the country together, you're a great leader, what would you tell him he should do to kind of bring the country together and maybe get rid of some of the partisan divide? Is there any one or two answers you would have?
Yes. First answer I would have is start reaching out to the whole country, and not just to a group of people who are your buddies, your gang. Get people on your staff who will argue with you. Get people who are working with you who will challenge you. Otherwise, you're not going to get the best. And the next thing I would tell them to do is, we have so many friends and allies in this world that we have put at risk to being friends and allies of us. That's not the way we gained ascendancy of this country. We gained ascendancy as the #1 nation of democracy in this country by talking to friends, by trusting people, by giving them what they need if it's reasonable. So many times in my career as a soldier, in my career as a national security advisor or sec state, I faced a problem from a friend, and I would sit and listen. I'd want to throw them out, I want to hear this, but I didn't. These are foreigners. And the stories are rather cute, but I don't have time to tell you all of them. But to have the quick one, when the Spanish foreign minister calls me, I'd never met her. She just got the job. And she said to me, you've got to help me. I said, what's wrong? We have an island just off the coast of North Africa. And the Moroccans took it. And when we saw that, we had to go and take it back. And you did that, yes. What's the problem? Well, now that they're coming back, and they won't stay away. So would you help us get a deal between us and the other side? And so I said, but it's not my business. Haven't you talked to the EU or NATO? Yes, we have. They turned us down. You got to do it. And so that's what I did. I worked on it for 2 days all by myself at home. I typed up the actual agreement between these two countries. My lawyers were not happy with that when they saw it the next week. But I solved it. And the only crisis I had was that they had two different names for the island. One, the African Asian name, and the other one was the European name. And so they said, well, we can't agree to this with two names. We'll never get agreement. So I thought about it and called down to my geographers in the State Department. I said, give me the exact place this island is located. What's its latitude, longitude?
Right.
Tell me exactly what it is. And that's what I got. And that's what I put in the agreement. There's no name, just latitude, longitude. And they agreed. That's it. You have to work hard and find solutions for your friends.
So you and your wife have led America's Promise for quite some time, an organization you helped start. And it's designed to help young people become productive citizens and maybe leaders as well.
Yeah.
To young people that talk to you and say, I want to be Colin Powell, I want to be a leader, I want to help my country, what do you think are the most important leadership qualities they should have? What is it that makes somebody a leader and somebody not a leader?
I tell you, can't be Colin Powell. Worry about being yourself. And here, first, America's Promise, we isolated this into 5 promises that we wanted every child in America to get. Promise number 1 is to make sure that you have an adult in your life. A responsible, loving, caring adult should be in the life of every child. Hopefully a parent, a relative, a mentor, but somebody who would put this child on the right path and not get in trouble. We don't have enough of these. The second promise was you need a place to go play. You need to have boys and girls clubs, things like that. And we have to put those together for these kids. And then the third was every youngster should have responsible health care. We don't do enough of this. The whole country ought to be on health care. And I've spoken out about this repeatedly. We deserve it for every American. And then the fourth promise was a quality education. Every kid, you cannot survive in this world, in this country, without some kind of quality education. And the fifth promise was make sure that you give back, that you are giving some service back to the country. It's a simple little formula, and it works if you put people to work on it. Boys and Girls Clubs, Salvation Armies, people like you, people like me, and that works fine.
So some people say, I've said, the highest calling of mankind is to be a private equity professional. Some people don't agree. Some people say the highest calling is to be a 4-star general. So John Allen is a 4-star general, head of Brookings, and you're a 4-star general. Why do you think 4-star generals are more important to the country than private equity people?
I've never presented myself as being more important than the country or anybody. Here I am. If you think I can do something for you, let's talk about it. And if I can, and if you can, if you're working with it as well, the guy who's calling me, I'll do it. And in many occasions when I was in the military, we didn't get that kind of option. Powell, go there. Powell, go there. You're now a 4-star general. You're now a corps commander in Germany with 70,000 troops. That made life a lot easier. You just did what you were told, because that's what the Army is all about. But when I left the Army, it was a little different. I had choices. I had choices that I had to take careful look at with my family, with my children, and with America's Promise Alliance. And it served me well, and it served those people well. But I've got no illusions about who I am and where I came from. The people who really taught me everything I need to know was Chinese military experts from 2,000 years ago and German experts. They're the ones who teach you about politics and making sure if you're going to war, you do it well and you prevail.
Final question. So you're a 4-star general and Secretary of State. You have grandchildren. Do they call you general? They call you Secretary of State? What do they call you?
Poppy.
And you tell them, by the way, I was a 4-star general, or you don't tell them
Oh,
that?
no, wouldn't work. They don't care. It's a family. And, when I was a junior officer, it didn't make any difference. But the more senior I became, okay, right, what's his name? And that's the way I wanted it. I didn't want to be anything special to my children. The one quick story is when I was promoted to brigadier general and I was stationed at Fort Carson, Colorado, and we just changed into these new camouflage uniforms, got rid of the old ones. It was cool. Nice camouflage uniform. And I put it on one day when I got it, And I went home wearing the camouflage uniform. This is maybe 20, 25 years ago. And so I walk in the house at Fort Carson, and my youngest child, Anne Marie, who you also know, I think, she was about 10 or 12 at the time. And she was watching TV, and she turned around, looked up, saw me, and said, "Mommy, the G.I. Joe's home." What are you going to do?
So, Colin, I want to thank you for your service to our country for many years. Thank you for doing this interview. And I'm sure if George Washington was here in person today, he'd say thank you for your service to the country as well.
And would I ever say thank you to him for what he did for the country, not just as a president, but as a human being who taught us what being a human being is all about. He didn't look for wars, but if one came, he would fight it and try to win. And then when he left us with some messages that I will never forget. His farewell speech, his comments about, don't look for wars. And he left us with that vision. And when he could have been the king of America or the special president of America, he just wanted to be the president. And he wanted it known that's all he is, the president. And then he decided to leave. He could have stayed a little longer, but he stayed long enough. And then he warned us about spending too much money on military, and he warned us about getting cocky. And he left us with a great set of rules, which are still valid to this day. And I know them well. I have read them over the years. I have used them repeatedly as I have walked through a problem. And what do I do now? He helped him.